People think a house is what you own. They forget the ground beneath it decides who wins. The diesel engine was already rumbling before the sun cleared the tops of the maple trees, sending a steady vibration through the cracked front porch where my grandfather used to drink black coffee every morning. The sharp smell of fresh hydraulic fluid mixed with damp Kentucky grass as a bright yellow bulldozer rolled toward the house my family had built 68 years ago with their own hands. Across the front yard stood Patricia Whitmore, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, dressed in a perfectly pressed white blazer that somehow looked untouched by the dust swirling around her polished heels. She glanced at her gold watch, lifted one manicured hand, and smiled the way people smile when they think history has already chosen their side. Behind her, neighbors gathered along the sidewalks with coffee mugs, folding chairs, and smartphones, whispering like they had front-row tickets to someone else's ending. A county inspector shuffled paperwork beside the demolition crew while two contractors adjusted orange barricades across my gravel driveway. Every sound felt unnaturally loud. The hiss of air brakes, the metallic clank of steel tracks settling into place, the flutter of a bright orange demolition notice taped across my front door. My name is Ethan Carter, and according to every official document those people believed they understood, I had exactly 12 minutes before the only home my family had ever known disappeared forever. Patricia folded her arms and looked directly at me with the kind of practiced confidence that comes from never hearing the word no. "Last chance, Mr. Carter," she called, her voice carrying across the yard with almost theatrical precision. "You ignored every violation, every hearing, and every opportunity to cooperate. This property has been declared a community nuisance." I looked down at the worn leather envelope resting quietly in my hands instead of answering her. The edges were cracked from decades inside an old fireproof safe, and the brass clasp carried tiny scratches left by my grandfather's pocketknife years before I was born. Nobody standing there paid the slightest attention to it. Why would they? Old paper never looks impressive next to heavy machinery. A television reporter adjusted her microphone near the mailbox while the cameraman framed the bulldozer perfectly against my house, probably imagining tonight's headline before a single brick had moved. Somewhere behind the crowd, a child asked his father if they were really going to knock the whole house down, and the man simply nodded without taking his eyes off Patricia. They all believed they were watching the final chapter of one stubborn homeowner refusing to accept progress. None of them understood they were actually standing at the beginning of the most expensive mistake an HOA could ever make. Because Patricia Whitmore believed she owned my lot. The county believed she owned my lot. Even the demolition contractor believed she owned my lot. What none of them knew was that my grandfather had never truly sold the ground beneath this neighborhood. And in less than an hour, every foundation supporting nearly 200 beautiful suburban homes would become the single most important piece of evidence in the entire state. The leather envelope felt heavier than paper should have felt, as if every crease carried the weight of people who understood that ownership was never about appearances. My grandfather, Walter Carter, used to tell me that land remembers every signature even after people forget every promise. I was 8 years old the first time he walked me across these rolling hills, long before there were paved streets, matching mailboxes, decorative fountains, or neighborhood committees pretending they had invented civilization. Back then, this place was 280 acres of open pasture, limestone ridges, and tall oak trees that creaked every autumn whenever the western wind rolled across central Kentucky. I still remember the smell of fresh-cut hay mixing with diesel from his old green tractor while he pointed toward the valley and said, "One day there will be houses here, Ethan. Plenty of them. But never confuse building on land with owning it." At the time, I thought he was simply talking like old farmers always did, wrapping ordinary lessons inside strange riddles. Years later, I realized every word had been painfully deliberate. My grandfather was not only a farmer. Before returning home from the Korean War, he had spent years working with civil survey crews mapping property lines across 3 counties. Boundaries fascinated him. He trusted measurements more than opinions and county records more than handshakes. When developers approached him in the late 1970s with plans to transform our farmland into what eventually became Willow Creek Estates, everyone expected him to refuse. Instead, he surprised the entire county by accepting the offer. People called him foolish for selling family land that had belonged to the Carters since 1956. They never understood what actually happened because they only saw the closing photographs published in the local newspaper. They saw smiling executives shaking hands beside oversized checks. They saw bulldozers arriving months later. They saw construction begin. What they never saw were the weeks my grandfather spent inside the office of a quiet real estate attorney named Howard Ellis, reading every page line by line under a brass desk lamp that stayed lit long after sunset. Walter Carter trusted very few people, but he trusted paperwork. He insisted on adding clauses that most developers barely noticed because they were too eager to break ground before competing companies bought neighboring farmland. Howard once joked that my grandfather negotiated like a chess player who thought 20 moves ahead. I laughed when he told me that story years later, but Howard never smiled. He simply looked at me across his desk and said, "Your grandfather did not sell everything they believed he sold." I did not understand what he meant until much later. After my parents passed away, I inherited the house along with a weathered fireproof safe tucked beneath the workshop floor. I rarely opened it because life carried me away. College became engineering school. Engineering school became infrastructure projects across several states. Bridges, drainage systems, flood control studies, and highway inspections filled my calendar for almost 2 decades. I came home whenever I could, kept the taxes current, repaired the roof after storms, and mowed the lawn myself whenever work allowed. The neighborhood around me grew wealthier every year, and with every new family came another layer of confidence that Willow Creek Estates had always belonged exactly as it appeared. They admired clean sidewalks and freshly painted fences. They never wondered what existed beneath their foundations because most people never question the ground until someone reminds them that every structure depends on something far older than concrete. The first time I met Patricia Whitmore, she smiled before she spoke, and somehow that made me trust her even less. It happened 3 years after I moved back into my grandfather's house full-time. I had just finished replacing a section of split-rail fence along the eastern property line when a spotless white luxury sport utility vehicle eased into my gravel driveway without so much as slowing for the dust. The engine went quiet, but the expensive perfume drifting from the open driver's door reached me before she did. Patricia stepped out carrying a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm, like a judge arriving to announce a verdict. She extended a perfectly manicured hand and introduced herself as the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Although the way she emphasized the title made it sound less like volunteer work and more like elected royalty. She complimented the scenery, admired the old farmhouse for exactly 3 seconds, then casually explained that my property no longer reflected the elevated standards the community was trying to achieve. I remember glancing toward the freshly painted porch, the trimmed grass, and the flower beds my mother had planted years before. Nothing about the place looked neglected. It simply looked older than the surrounding homes. Patricia noticed my expression and offered another polished smile. "You have wonderful potential here, Mr. Carter. We simply want everything to feel unified." Unified became one of her favorite words. Within weeks, I began receiving friendly reminder letters about mailbox colors, driveway, gravel, porch lighting, and landscaping preferences that somehow always involved spending thousands of dollars. Every envelope arrived on heavy cream-colored paper with elegant lettering that made unreasonable demands appear almost sophisticated. At first, I treated them as suggestions and filed them neatly inside a kitchen drawer. Then the letters became violation notices. After that came inspection reports complete with photographs taken from angles that made perfectly ordinary details appear unacceptable. My workshop was suddenly labeled visually inconsistent. The weathered oak tree my grandfather planted became an obstruction to community aesthetics. Even the limestone retaining wall built by my father decades earlier somehow failed to satisfy updated architectural harmony guidelines. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Patricia remained calm, pleasant, and relentlessly certain that she represented common sense, while I represented stubborn nostalgia. During monthly HOA meetings, she stood behind a polished wooden podium and spoke about property values, neighborhood excellence, and protecting investments. Residents nodded along because everything she said sounded reasonable until you realized every solution required someone else to surrender a little more control. She had an unusual talent for making people believe convenience and authority were the same thing. Slowly, the board stopped questioning her recommendations. Contractors began asking for her approval before speaking with homeowners. Even county employees seemed to recognize her name before mine. Willow Creek became less like a neighborhood and more like a carefully managed corporation where appearance outweighed history. Then one afternoon, I overheard two real estate agents chatting outside the community clubhouse while I picked up my mail. One of them pointed toward my house and laughed quietly. "Once that old place is gone," she said, "Patricia finally gets her clubhouse. Home values will jump another 10%. They had not noticed me standing 20 feet away. Neither of them lowered their voices because they assumed the outcome had already been decided. As I drove home beneath rows of ornamental maple trees planted where my grandfather once grazed cattle, the late afternoon sun reflected across hundreds of identical rooftops stretching farther than I could see. Every family believed they owned a perfect piece of Willow Creek estates. Patricia believed she controlled every decision inside those entrance signs. The only person who knew the neighborhood still rested on promises made decades earlier was quietly driving back to the oldest house on the only lot she had never truly understood. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It settled in one carefully planned layer at a time, like fresh asphalt covering an old country road until nobody remembered what used to be underneath. The first real blow came on an unusually cool Monday morning in early October. I opened my mailbox expecting utility bills and found a certified envelope nearly half an inch thick. The paper smelled faintly of fresh printer ink as I unfolded page after page of alleged violations. Improper exterior appearance, unauthorized accessory structure, non-compliant fencing, failure to maintain architectural consistency. The list stretched across 12 pages, complete with color photographs, inspection dates, and daily fines that somehow added up to more than $12,000. I read every word twice before setting the packet on my kitchen table where my grandfather's old cast-iron coffee pot still sat beside the window. Outside, the wind stirred dry leaves across the front yard, and for the first time in years the house felt strangely quiet. I attended the next HOA board meeting carrying county records, photographs, and receipts proving every repair had been completed according to local building codes. Patricia barely glanced at my documents before thanking me for my comments and moving to the next agenda item. The board approved every recommendation she presented in less than 15 minutes. Their votes were so automatic that several members never even looked up from their folders. Walking back through the clubhouse parking lot, I overheard Patricia telling someone, "Eventually, he will realize cooperation is much cheaper than resistance." That sentence stayed with me for weeks. Then the contractors started appearing. Survey stakes showed up near the edge of my driveway without explanation. Bright orange paint appeared along the roadside after sunrise one Friday morning. A utility crew parked beside my fence, claiming they were marking future improvements requested by the association. Every answer led to another office, another department, another form. Nobody seemed willing to admit who had authorized anything. The smell of spray paint lingered in the cool autumn air long after the trucks disappeared. A month later, I returned from inspecting a bridge project nearly 60 miles away and found a temporary chain stretched across my gravel entrance with a laminated notice hanging from the middle. Community Access Improvement Project. Temporary restrictions apply. I stood there listening to the chain rattle softly in the breeze while my truck idled behind me. My own driveway had been partially blocked by equipment belonging to a landscaping contractor hired by the HOA. The foreman apologized politely, explaining he was following approved site plans provided by Patricia's office. He even handed me a copy. My property had been shaded in pale blue with handwritten notes labeling sections as future recreational expansion. Recreational expansion. Those two words echoed through my head during the entire drive into town. At the county planning office, a clerk quietly admitted that preliminary discussions had been submitted regarding possible redevelopment of my parcel if the existing residents were ever declared unsafe or abandoned. Unsafe. Abandoned. Neither description remotely matched reality, yet somehow they had already entered official conversations. By winter, the notices became even more aggressive. A hearing was scheduled without my agreement. A recommendation for structural evaluation followed. Then came a formal request for demolition review based on what Patricia described as irreversible deterioration affecting surrounding property values. Standing on my porch one freezing December evening, I watched Christmas lights glowing across hundreds of beautiful homes built on what had once been my grandfather's pasture. Somewhere beyond those rooftops, children laughed while families gathered for dinner, completely unaware that the same board claiming to protect their neighborhood had quietly spent months trying to erase the last house that connected every one of them to the land beneath their feet. By the time spring arrived, I had spent more hours inside county offices than inside my own living room. Every hallway smelled like old paper, floor polish, and stale coffee, and every conversation seemed to end with another recommendation to settle before things became more expensive. My first attorney flipped through the growing stack of notices, sighed quietly, and admitted that fighting an organized homeowners association with deep financial reserves could drag on for years. He never said I could not win. He simply said I probably could not afford to keep trying. That sentence echoed in my head during the drive home as rain tapped steadily across my windshield. For the first time since my grandfather passed away, the farmhouse felt almost unfamiliar. The silence inside seemed heavier than the walls themselves. Yet something about giving up never sat right with me. Engineers are trained to question assumptions, especially when every calculation appears too convenient. Patricia's entire campaign rested on one assumption that everyone accepted without hesitation. They believed the paperwork supporting Willow Creek Estates was complete. Nobody seemed interested in asking whether anything had been left behind decades earlier. While I continued answering notices and attending hearings, the pressure outside only intensified. Local social media groups filled with comments describing me as the homeowner refusing to modernize. A community newsletter praised the board for protecting neighborhood standards without mentioning my side of the story once. Driving through the subdivision became uncomfortable because conversations stopped whenever I walked past small groups gathered beside mailboxes or neighborhood parks. Some neighbors looked genuinely sympathetic, but quickly lowered their eyes before speaking. Others smiled politely, convinced they were watching necessary progress. Patricia handled every public appearance with remarkable confidence. She thanked volunteers, congratulated landscaping committees, and spoke about preserving the future while quietly treating my home as though it had already disappeared. Then the certified letter arrived that changed everything. The county had officially scheduled a final administrative review regarding demolition authorization. I unfolded the pages across my kitchen table while the late afternoon sun stretched through the dusty windows my father had installed nearly 40 years earlier. Every paragraph sounded final. Every signature looked legitimate. Every deadline seemed designed to leave me with fewer options than the day before. I walked into my grandfather's old workshop that evening searching for nothing in particular, mostly hoping familiar surroundings would clear my head. The room still smelled faintly of cedar shavings, machine oil, and aged leather despite years of careful cleaning. His workbench remained exactly where he left it, covered with hand tools polished smooth from decades of use. I ran my hand across the scarred wooden surface until my fingers stopped on a tiny brass key taped beneath the edge with brittle yellow masking tape. My heart slowed instead of racing because I recognized my grandfather's handwriting on the tape. 2 words: second safe. I stared at that key for several seconds while dust drifted through narrow beams of sunlight cutting across the room. Suddenly, I remembered something Howard Ellis had said years earlier before retiring. Your grandfather always believed people protect the obvious and overlook the essential. I walked toward the far corner of the workshop where an old storage cabinet had not been moved since I was a teenager. Behind it, hidden inside the concrete foundation itself, sat a narrow steel door almost invisible beneath layers of paint and time. The brass key fit perfectly. As the lock turned with a slow metallic click that echoed through the quiet room, I realized Patricia had spent 3 years searching every public record she could find. She had never once imagined the most important document in Willow Creek's history had never left this house. The steel door opened with a slow groan that filled the workshop like a voice I had not heard in years. Cool air drifted out, carrying the unmistakable smell of aged paper, cedar, and machine oil. Inside sat 3 weathered document boxes, each carefully labeled in my grandfather's neat handwriting. Survey records, development agreement, original instruments. I knelt on the concrete floor and lifted the first lid with both hands. Every folder was wrapped inside wax paper to protect it from moisture, every page organized with the precision only Walter Carter could have managed. He had prepared this room as though he knew someone would eventually need every single document. My fingertips paused on a folded county plat map nearly 4 feet wide. The paper crackled softly as I spread it across the old workbench beneath the yellow glow of a hanging shop light. Colored property lines stretched across what had once been open pasture, and there, beneath layers of handwritten notes, sat a thick red boundary surrounding the entire future subdivision. In the corner rested the signature of Howard Ellis along with county recording stamps dating back more than 40 years. At first glance, everything appeared ordinary, exactly like every other development plat I had reviewed during my engineering career. Then I noticed the attached amendment clipped behind the final page. It carried a different fill-in. Rebecca Lawson surprised me with one piece of advice before I left her office. "Do not rush," she said as she closed the last binder and rested both hands on the stack of original records. "People who believe they already own everything usually make their biggest mistakes after they think they have one." The word stayed with me during the drive back to Willow Creek. The late afternoon sun reflected off hundreds of identical rooftops, while sprinklers clicked rhythmically across perfectly trimmed lawns. Everything looked peaceful, almost artificial, like the neighborhood had been designed to convince people that order could never be questioned. I parked beside my workshop and looked across the subdivision without feeling angry anymore. For the first time in months, I understood exactly where patience would become my greatest advantage. Rebecca immediately assembled a small team that specialized in historic title research, licensed land surveying, and recorded easement interpretation. None of them contacted the HOA. None of them filed public objections. They simply gathered evidence. A survey crew quietly located every original monument my grandfather had referenced decades earlier. Several brass markers still rested exactly where Walter Carter had placed them beneath mature oak trees and along limestone fence lines. County archive specialists requested certified copies of recording books that had not been opened in years. Every discovery strengthened the same conclusion. The legal history beneath Willow Creek was far more complicated than the simplified version everyone had accepted. Meanwhile, Patricia grew even more confident. A notice appeared announcing a ceremonial groundbreaking for the future community center planned on my home site immediately after demolition. The neighborhood newsletter included colorful architectural drawings showing walking paths, picnic tables, and decorative fountains where my porch still stood. Residents congratulated the board for its vision. Several stopped me while I checked my mailbox and politely suggested I accept the inevitable because progress benefited everyone. I thanked them, smiled, and said almost nothing. Silence became part of the strategy. Every additional announcement issued by the HOA became another dated exhibit documenting exactly what they believed they controlled. Every contractor agreement, promotional brochure, engineering proposal, and board resolution created another paper trail built upon the same assumption. Rebecca explained that assumptions become surprisingly expensive when official decisions rely upon them. 2 weeks before the scheduled demolition, we quietly submitted requests for certified historical surveys, updated title confirmations, and authenticated copies of every original development instrument. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no flashing headlines or emergency hearings. Government offices simply began reviewing records that had not received serious attention in decades. Patricia interpreted the silence as surrender. She even waved to me one morning while standing beside survey flags planted near my front yard, thanking the contractors for keeping the project ahead of schedule. She never realized another survey crew had already completed a completely different assignment less than 24 hours earlier, using equipment capable of matching every modern boundary to the original plats recorded by my grandfather. The final piece arrived 3 days before demolition when the county recorder delivered certified copies bearing raised seals and official authentication stamps. Rebecca laid every document across a conference table in perfect chronological order. Looking from one page to the next felt like watching a puzzle assemble itself without forcing a single piece into place. She looked at me calmly and said, "Now we stop arguing about opinions. From this moment forward, we let the records speak for themselves." I slipped the original leather envelope back into my grandfather's safe that evening and carried only certified copies home. Outside, Willow Creek looked exactly as it always had. Inside those folders rested enough documented history to change the future of every address built upon land that my grandfather had understood far better than anyone had ever imagined. The morning of the demolition arrived with a cold breeze carrying the smell of damp earth and diesel fuel across the front yard. By 7:30, contractors had already positioned orange barriers along the road, while neighbors gathered quietly behind them, wrapped in light jackets and holding steaming coffee cups. The bulldozer idled only 50 feet from my porch, its engine producing the same steady vibration I had felt at dawn in my grandfather's old tractor decades earlier. The irony almost made me smile. Patricia Whitmore stood beside the county inspector speaking confidently, occasionally pointing toward my house as if she were giving a guided tour of a project she had personally designed. Television cameras returned, hoping to capture the symbolic removal of the last old farmhouse in Willow Creek Estates. Their lenses stayed fixed on me, expecting frustration or desperation. Instead, I remained exactly where I had been standing, holding a slim leather portfolio that looked far too ordinary to matter. At precisely 7:43, Rebecca Lawson stepped out of a dark sedan, carrying 2 archival storage boxes and a narrow tube containing certified survey maps. Behind her came a licensed surveyor, a title examiner, and an assistant from the county records office. None of them raised their voices. None of them hurried. They simply walked toward the inspection table with the calm confidence of people who trusted documented history more than public opinion. The county inspector accepted the sealed records, broke the certification envelope, and began reviewing page after page, while the surveyor carefully unrolled a large color plat map across the hood of a pickup truck. Morning sunlight reflected across the protective plastic covering as original property lines appeared beside modern satellite overlays. Every brass monument recovered during the recent survey matched the handwritten coordinates recorded more than 40 years earlier. Patricia leaned forward, her confident expression softening for the first time since I had known her. She pointed toward one paragraph, then another, speaking quietly with the inspector. Rebecca calmly produced additional certified copies from the second archive box. The title examiner explained how the recorded amendment had remained legally attached to the original development agreement despite being indexed separately under agricultural archives. Nothing had been hidden. It had simply been overlooked for decades because everyone assumed the simplified subdivision records told the complete story. The inspector requested several phone calls to county legal counsel before making another notation across his clipboard. Around us, conversations faded into complete silence except for the distant hum of lawn sprinklers beginning their morning cycle across neighboring yards. Even the television crew lowered their microphones, sensing the story had quietly changed direction. The demolition contractor eventually climbed down from his machine after receiving instructions to shut off the engine. The sudden silence felt almost overwhelming after listening to diesel vibrations all morning. Patricia looked toward me as though expecting an explanation I had already given months earlier through every unanswered document and every ignored hearing. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice steady and respectful. The historical record does not support the ownership assumptions used to authorize today's demolition process. Until these title questions receive formal judicial determination, proceeding would create significant legal exposure for every participating party. Those words settled across the gathering more heavily than any dramatic argument ever could have. The orange demolition notice still fluttered gently against my front door, but no one moved toward the house anymore. They were no longer looking at weathered siding or old porch railings. They were looking at maps, signatures, recording stamps, and forgotten agreements that had quietly outlived every board election, every architectural guideline, and every confident assumption built upon land my grandfather had understood better than anyone standing there that morning. The weeks that followed transformed Willow Creek more quietly than anyone expected. There were no dramatic speeches on front lawns and no celebrations filling the neighborhood streets. Instead, there were depositions, title reviews, engineering reports, and long days inside conference rooms where every confident assumption was measured against documents that had patiently survived for decades. Rebecca Lawson and the county legal staff worked through thousands of pages of recorded instruments while independent surveyors verified every original monument my grandfather had referenced. The The conclusion never changed because facts rarely do. The historical agreements remained valid. The recorded reservations had never been released, and multiple decisions made by the Homeowners Association had relied upon an incomplete understanding of the original development documents. Faced with that reality, the demolition order was permanently withdrawn before it ever reached another hearing. The proposed community center disappeared from every planning document almost overnight. Contractors quietly removed their equipment. The orange barriers vanished before sunrise one morning, and the heavy silence that settled across my front yard felt far more satisfying than any argument I could have delivered. Patricia Whitmore resigned several weeks later after the board voted to appoint independent legal counsel to review years of association decisions. I never attended that meeting. I was replacing weathered porch boards with fresh white oak while the smell of sawdust drifted through the warm summer air exactly as it had when my father taught me to use his old circular saw. Around noon, one of my neighbors walked across the yard carrying a homemade peach pie and introduced himself properly for the first time despite living 3 streets away for nearly 7 years. He admitted that many residents had simply trusted whatever they were told because they assumed someone else had already verified the facts. Over the following months, more neighbors stopped by, not to apologize for every rumor they had believed, but to ask questions about the history of the land beneath their homes. I showed several families copies of old photographs where cattle once grazed beside places that were now playgrounds and walking trails. Children laughed while comparing faded black and white pictures to the same hills outside my porch, amazed that familiar streets had once been open fields stretching toward the horizon. Howard Ellis visited one final time before moving closer to his grandchildren. He stood quietly beside the old fence at sunset, looked across the neighborhood, and smiled. Walter knew buildings would change, he said. That is why he protected the part nobody could easily see. After he drove away, I unlocked the workshop safe one last time and returned every original document to its place inside the steel compartment beneath the floor. The leather envelope rested exactly where my grandfather had intended, no longer carrying uncertainty, but preserving a lesson that had outlived every election, every board meeting, and every ambitious plan. Sometimes I sit on the same porch where this story began, listening to the evening chorus of crickets while sprinklers whisper across carefully maintained lawns in the distance. Willow Creek is still a beautiful neighborhood, and I genuinely hope it stays that way for generations. The difference now is that its leaders understand something my grandfather tried to teach me when I was only 8 years old. Authority can be borrowed. Popularity can disappear. Rules can be rewritten. But truth recorded with patience has a way of waiting quietly beneath the surface until the day someone finally remembers to look down. And that is why I never hated the people who stood outside my house that morning. They were looking at walls. I was looking at the ground beneath their feet. In the end, justice never arrived with raised voices. It arrived with careful records, honest measurements, and a promise made decades earlier that refused to be forgotten.